So when the world saw Yugoslavia just spiral into this incredibly brutal war back in the 1990s, a lot of people were left wondering, where did all this hate, this extreme violence, actually come from? Today, we're going to dig into a really powerful analysis that looks past the politics, beyond the headlines, and deep into the hidden psychological trauma that might have been simmering for generations.
You know, it's pretty easy to romanticize the past, right? You have thinkers like Simone de Beauvoir looking at traditional, rural life in the Balkans and seeing something pure. She saw this harsh happiness, a place where real human values hadn't been corrupted yet. It's a really beautiful picture. But was it real?
Because then you get this, a totally different reality from Milovan Djilas, a man who was actually from there, who lived it. No harsh happiness in sight. For him, it was a life defined by three things: hunger, hatred, and death. And this contrast really gets to the heart of the matter.
So how do you square that? How can the same place be seen as both a pastoral dream and a living nightmare? Well, the source material we're digging into today makes a powerful case that the answer is hidden deep inside the traditional family structure.
Okay, so to get to the bottom of this, our first step has to be to take apart this myth of the simple, noble life. We've got to look right past that romanticized picture to see the brutal machinery that was working just underneath the surface.
And this is where we find the core argument. Historian Alenka Puhar says, if you want to understand the contradiction, you have to understand one specific social unit, the traditional Balkan joint family household. It was called the Zadruga.
All right, so let's step inside the Zadruga. It's been called a kind of pressure cooker. And in this section, we're going to see what that world was really like, the world that shaped generations, and, you could argue, laid the foundation for everything that came later.
So what was a Zadruga exactly? Well, first off, don't think of it like a modern nuclear family. This was a big, communal household. Multiple related families, all living together, all working together, and all under the absolute, unquestioned rule of the oldest man, the patriarch.
So, what was it like for a kid growing up in this system? According to Puhar's research, it was grim. We're talking about constant, severe punishment. A crowded life, but one of total emotional neglect. Affection was basically unheard of. Abuse, physical and sexual, was widespread. And from the moment you were born, you were taught one thing above all else: bury your feelings. Never show weakness.
And the physical conditions were just as harsh as the emotional ones. This historian, remembering his own childhood, talks about sleeping with a dozen other people on the floor of one small room. The sanitation was awful, flies everywhere. It was this life of extreme, crowded intimacy, but with zero real emotional connection. You're crammed together, but you've never felt more alone.
And this traditional proverb, wow, it's chilling because it shows you just how normalized, how justified this violence was. The stick came out of paradise. Think about that. Hitting a child wasn't just seen as normal. It was seen as something righteous, something holy, a tool for creating order sent down from heaven itself.
Okay, so if you raise generations and generations of kids in this intense pressure cooker of violence and silence, where does all that rage go? I mean, it has to find a way out, right? It has to have an outlet.
Puhar's analysis suggests that all this bottled-up aggression split off into two main channels. One was kept secret, hidden behind closed doors, a source of private shame. The other? It was put on a stage for everyone to see, a source of national pride.
So on the one hand, you have the private violence turning inward: domestic abuse, sexual violence, cruelty towards anyone weaker in the family. But then all that same energy gets channeled outward and transformed. It becomes national mythology, a righteous call for holy vengeance, and the glorification of the warrior. So violence at home was a deep, hidden shame, but violence for the nation? That was the highest honor.
The Kosovo myth is the perfect example of this in action. The Serbs suffered this massive military defeat way back in 1389, but over time the story got flipped. It was reframed as a kind of moral victory, a sacred sacrifice. Suddenly, suffering wasn't just suffering anymore, it was a holy trial you had to endure. To avenge Kosovo became this national obsession, and being a great fighter, that became the absolute highest virtue a man could have.
So, we've got the personal trauma, and we've got the national myths. How do you get from one to the other? How does a person's deep-seated private pain get turned into a political weapon, a public call for war?
To really see how this works, the source gives us two incredibly powerful examples. We're going to look at the lives of the writer Momo Kapoor and the playwright Jovan Radulovic. Their stories really show you the mechanism in action.
Let's start with Momo Kapoor. I mean, look at this life. His childhood was literally shattered by war. His mother was killed in a bombing, and he was pulled from the rubble as a little boy. He spent his youth in orphanages, apparently just consumed with fantasies of revenge. Fast forward a few decades, and that private, personal need for vengeance has completely morphed. He becomes a leading nationalist voice, calling for the destruction of his very own hometown, Sarajevo.
And in the case of Jovan Radulović is even more revealing, because it shows you the mechanism, step by step. So he suffers this horrific abuse as a child. He then writes a play about it, a really controversial play showing all this horrifying detail. But here's what happens. The public debate totally ignores the child abuse part. Instead, everyone starts talking about the national conflicts between Serbs and Croats. His personal, private pain gets co-opted and reframed as a national trauma. And suddenly, he's a hero. And his personal cry for revenge is heard as the voice of the entire nation.
Which brings us to the big picture, the final act. If you think of all of Yugoslavia as one giant, deeply troubled Zadruga, what happens when the patriarch is finally gone?
Well, from this psycho-historical perspective, the death of Tito in 1980 was the spark that lit the fuse. He was the state's ultimate patriarch, the one holding it all together. Once he was gone, the authority figure was gone, and the family structure just imploded. All the repressed anger, the old rivalries, the generations of trauma that had been kept under a lid finally, violently exploded. And this quote from Alenka Puhar just says it all, doesn't it? It captures the tragedy perfectly. The new freedom that came after Tito's death could have been an opportunity for healing, for working through the past, but instead, it became an opportunity to inflict that same past pain onto somebody else.
So really, that's the devastating takeaway from this analysis. The war wasn't just a political event. It was a massive, collective flashback. It was the chaos and torture of childhood projected onto the national stage. The private hell of the home became the public hell of the battlefield.
And that leaves us with this really huge and, frankly, unsettling question. It forces us to look at the hidden histories that shape our world and to wonder, to understand the wars between nations, maybe we first have to understand the wars inside their homes. How much of our collective destiny is decided long before we ever reach adulthood?